So I'll try to speak slowly so that the translators have an opportunity to convert my words into ones that you'll be able to understand empathetically. And I'll just begin by saying, before we get started, that I'm coming to you from Australia, which is a beautiful country, and I just would take a moment to pay respect to the traditional custodians of country here. I'm coming from the Illawarra, as you can see pictured here, and I just want to pay respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Okay. I've been working on topics of empathy in some form or another for a very long time, and in particularly in a few decades ago, when theory of mind and simulation theory were the only games in town. And that's kind of where we're going to start. In a 30-minute talk, I don't have time to go through all that background. There's plenty of written material I could direct people to if they wanted it. So we're going to start in media res, as it were, and I'm just going to pick up a thread of some ongoing discussions and see if I can advance up the position or bring out some of the subtleties of the position that I'd like to push for. Primarily, just to say at the beginning, I'm going to focus a bit more on the role that narratives play and the role that enactive imagining plays in our receipt and appreciation of narratives of others as what I consider to be the basis for empathy. But the long and short of it is, I think of empathy as an engagement primarily, and one that is temporally extended across time by various means. So empathizing with others isn't a special cognitive capacity to bridge a gap between others and ourselves. It's an activity that we engage in that we can be more or less skilled at in being able to come to terms with the other situation. And so it's, for me, it's not a matter of capturing the other completely, or even being able, even that idea that we can fully understand the other is not something I think that we should think of as the core objective of empathy. And so that's really the nuts and bolts of what I want to say before we get going. But that's the position I want to defend, as opposed to other accounts that are in the literature, which I'll talk about in a moment. So in the spirit of being in media res, I'm going to simply read this. This is from a recent volume that I have a paper in with a co-authored, and it in the introduction, it reads, quote, "Philosophers such as Daniel D. Hutto," it's rather specific, actually, I think they might have me in mind, "have never accepted that perspective taking is the primary mechanism for understanding others, but rather propose a form of socio-cultural account, which has at its heart narrative understanding." And so they reference the papers. The key here is the challenge to the idea that that perspective taking is the core or primary way that we come to understand others. And that will be central in what I'm going to talk about today, and that challenge. In fact, the editors go on to say this also, quote, of the paper that I co-authored with Alan Jurgens for this volume, quote, "Hutto and Jurgens argue that it is possible to narratively understand and effectively respond in hot, that is, emotional ways, to others with which we do not share much. And this shows that enactive empathy is possible even when simulation is not." And that, again, is going to be one of the major themes I'll be exploring in this, this presentation. So I'll just give a very quick word as to why I think narratives, there's a need for narratives when it comes to understanding others. And in particular, I think narratives play the right part here, as opposed to something like theories, as per theories of mind, which are, for our purposes, I think, always speculative and not directly engaging. to understand another situation, we need to engage directly with their stories, not to speculate about them by means of theories or and that is because only the stories of another come in a form of quote a Greg Curry, rich, particularized, and unified histories of cycles of thoughts, actions, and contingencies. And it's those contingencies and particularities that we really need to get acquainted with if we're going to understand and, in a sense, empathize with another. And here's the same point being underscored nicely by Peter Goldie. Quote, narratives provide explanations of why someone had a particular motive or why someone has a particular character or personality trait, or why someone was drunk, depressed, or angry. And the explanations we get at are narrative historical explanations. They locate the motive, the trait, the undue influence on thinking within a wider nexus, in a way that enables us to understand more deeply why someone did the thing they did through appeal to aspects of their personal history or circumstances. And that's the key to this. We must, if we're going to not have merely speculative proposals about what the other's doing, we need to be able to engage directly with their background and story. And it's only through the narratives they give themselves do we get at an understanding of how they see things in their own particular way. Now, the current state of the debate, at least as of 2019, there has been some pushback even from people who are broadly friendly to that suggestion. So that's where we're beginning. Carsten Stuber, for example, in that volume, agrees with us that it's narratives that are wanted, not theories, because they provide an understanding of the individuality of a reason or a motive, rather than give us typical ground. So it's the only way to zoom in on why the individual did what they did and how they see things as such. However, Carsten also wants to push back against the idea that we can do away with the notion of simulation. So he says, or believes, or for him, narratives involve an enactment of perspective of the other. And it's only by doing this, only by coming to take the perspective of the other, that we can fully understand their reasons for actions. So to bolster this, he's not saying it's sufficient, but he is saying simulation is a must. So he's advancing a necessity claim, and it's a claim that he's been advancing for some time. Here we go. Quote, understanding other agents seems to acquire that I am able to recognize particular aspects of their situation relevant to their actions. And in order to do that, he tells us, and this is the key, the crux of this discussion, I have to put myself in their shoes and practically evaluate what aspects of the situation have to be regarded as relevant. And the suggestion here, of course, is that by putting oneself in those shoes, you can then begin to see what's relevant to the other. Now, simulation theory, as it's known, its big idea, as we just saw, is that to simulate, we must, quote, put ourselves in the shoes of the other, or that we must somehow, quote, take the perspective of the other. And it is assumed that we come to understand the other by replicating the target's mental states, their thoughts or feelings in ourselves. Or again, another way of capturing the core ideas are understanding other minds empathetically on this account essentially involves modeling other minds by manipulating aspects of our own mind. And that's the key of it. Now, I'm not going to rehearse this very much, but a fundamental problem that usually accompanies at least pure simulation theory of proposals is it raises the question of how the simulator, either the person or their subpersonal devices, whichever you think is doing the simulation, know which are the relevant adjustments to make when adjusting for differences between the self and the target. How is it decided, for example, or determined which aspects or attributes of the other are to feature in the simulation and which not? And so that has been, I think, a well-worn objection, and a problem is that without some surrounding mechanism to do that, or means to do that, it doesn't seem plausible that you would know how to go about the simulation in question. This will become pertinent later. But just to give an example from a very old objection of my own, when Alvin Goldman first presented his very particular version of this in terms of offline practical reasoning, one of my complaints, as you can see on the slide, is that whilst the pretend belief desire generator was directing the activity of the system, there are different boxes in his boxology, as it were. There's no input on this diagram to the belief desire generator. So somehow it turns out to be a rather magical box that knows what to do. So that, I think, was an old school concern. I want to jump ahead. So Karsten has laid down the challenge, but I want to jump ahead to some recent work, and I want to dig in a little to see if we can see how we might reconceive, as we get a more nuanced understanding of what simulation is supposed to do, to, I hope, to leave behind the very idea altogether. So I want to look for a moment at new work by Heidi Maybaum and her new book, The Space Between. Now, Heidi says, and very optimistically, that, quote, we can understand other people almost as well as we can understand ourselves, in principle at least, because we use largely the same methods in both cases. Now, Heidi's a good friend, but what method does she in fact suggest we are using? And she tells us it's putting yourself in her shoes. So again, the idea is that the core mechanism for understanding comes in the same mode as Karsten is suggesting. It's through being in the situation somehow, and this notion of putting ourselves in another's shoes, that we get a grip on their situations. And core to her thinking is that we need to put ourselves in our own shoes sometimes, our own older shoes, if we are to understand our own shifty selves. And the core thought there is that we change over time. What we think, what we want, how we act, and so on, don't remain static. Our characters change, and as she puts it, our background psychology, which helps make sense of our momentary experiences, is in constant flux. I actually tend to agree with her about the point that we're in constant flux, but the example she's giving is, when we try to understand our own past reactions to situations, if we've changed and moved on, just recovering the feeling or the memory in isolation, we might find it quite alien to how we now think. And I think that is a genuine phenomena. But she goes on and borrows again from one of the fathers of simulation theory, the idea that in order to make sense of even our own selves, what we do is we, as she puts it, shift our egocentric center of gravity, borrowing that idea from Gordon, into another person, which could be ourselves, keeping in mind seemingly relevant differences, but otherwise counting on our psychology to fill in and do the rest, which would mean that you'd have to pick out exactly the precise, correct, relevant differences in order for that to happen. And she then goes on to say that activity itself leads to perspective taking that is neither simple projection nor detached description. So that's the lively element at the core of our empathizing efforts. And as she goes on to say, and this is the subtitle, or actually the main title of the book, she wants to capture the idea that, quote, we are neither in these cases quite ourselves nor the other person when we engage in those acts of imagination. We are those that are trying to understand. As she puts it, we are in a manner of speaking in the space between the two, in some kind of territory, different from normal. She gives an example. This is not her, but I just chose this to make the image vivid. She gives the example of a case in which she was a friend offered to drive her back after she'd had an extra drink, and the friend was driving her own, that is to say, Heidi's car. And her friend called Julia was handling the car in a way that made Heidi anxious. So her core example here is one in which she felt both the pressure to be grateful to her friend for doing the job of driving him home, but also was critical of the way that she was driving, and said so to her friend. So in this account of what's going on between them, she feels guilty and angry because she starts instructing her friend how to handle the car. So here's the example played out. She says, of course, Julia manages to save the day by engaging in a bit of simulative perspective taking. And this is what she says, quote, simple projection would not have helped. Instead, Julia imagines herself in the passenger seat of her own car. It's one part of the activity. Then she imagines someone she is close to, not herself, driving that car. So she makes these imaginative adjustments and situates herself not in the exact situation that Heidi's in, but in one equivalent to it that she can make comparisons from. Quote, she identifies first what the problem is. And this is an interesting point. I'll come back to it. It's not actually the way she's driving so much as the fact that she's driving my car. She then imagines another person driving her own car while she watches from the passenger seat. And from that position, she finds it easy to imagine getting agitated about how that person drives her car, even if that person, in this example, her husband, is a perfectly good driver. And so she comes on Heidi's account to empathize successfully with her and understand her, in this instance, by this act of simulative reimagining. I think the substance of this is okay, but I want to change over. I want to question whether this is a simulation actually, or whether it's a form of enactive imagining. So Heidi tells us, quote, what drives this transformation is Julia's replacing in the imagination objects that are related to me in a certain way for objects that are related to her in a very similar way. Her car, not mine, her husband, not her, and so on. That is what is perspectival, she says, about perspective taking. But I want to say, au contraire, I don't want to add too many other languages into this, but au contraire, the act of Julie's imagining, I think, is actually driven by Julie's appreciating and being moved by the details of Heidi's situation. They are not conveyed in the form of a narrative in this instance, but she's aware of them because she's already part of that story. It is dynamic, full-bodied, emotionally engaged imagining. And she's moved by what she gleans of Heidi's situation in a way that recalls and revives in herself experiences she has had of undergoing something somewhat similar in somewhat similar circumstances. So what happens, I think, is more that she gets the gist of the story of Heidi's situation, and that evokes these relevant comparisons, which are of a emotionally charged and engaged nature. As Heidi herself says in the book, quote, the real issue concerns how a person's psychological background, her knowledge and her experience, her wants and needs, her habitual ways of thinking, and so on, interacts with the particular experience she is having in a situation. But what strikes me here is that what's driving that is either, in this instance, perhaps a lucky guess. And if that hadn't worked, then it would have been more details that Heidi herself would have been able to give that would have driven the act of imagining. So what I'm suggesting is that if we think about these cases carefully, the core process of wearing our own shoes again, if it were doing this with ourselves or with others, or slipping into those of another's shoes, isn't really a matter of projecting from me to you, nor in fact is it really shoe jumping at all. That gets that account, I think, gets the direction of engaged emotional fit wrong. It's rather something like this: appreciating the other's situation, however partial, is what prompts emotionally charged, embodied, enactive imagining, which is enriched by attending to the details of the other situation, even in the cases where that other may be us. In the tricky cases, and this is important, we become acquainted with the relevant details and background by hearing the other stories. In the other case, I don't deny that there might be cases where that might be unnecessary because things are more straightforward, but that's just shows that we don't have to work hard in those cases to empathize with the other. Final section, and then I'll close off. I just want to examine how this alternate account that doesn't involve simulation or perspective taking or putting ourselves in shoes could potentially have the benefit of avoiding some epistemic harms that have been raised or highlighted by some in a recent paper. So a very recent paper that I have only just seen raises some questions and concerns about empathy in phenomenological psychopathology. So it's in a more clinical settings, not in everyday settings, but I think the same points will cover across different domains. And the core of it is, in this paper, Spencer and Broom contend that traditional accounts of empathic understanding risk engendering three epistemic harms. The first is misunderstanding the lived experience of the patient, or co-opting the lived experience of the patient, and finally, objectifying the patient. And the authors recommend, to help guard against this, adopting Fricker's account of virtuous listening and Merleau-Ponty's phenomenology of speech expression to reinstate the epistemic agency of the psychiatric patient, or if we were talking in more everyday contexts, the other, more generally. Now, there's a risk of misunderstanding the lived experience of the other if we operate on the assumption that understanding another is to be achieved by getting an insider take on their perspective in the first place. And this is, I think, the most fundamental point. It's subtle, but fundamental. We're not, if the account that I'm offering is on the money, it's suggesting that we shouldn't be trying to do that as an ambition. So a more intellectually humble approach to empathizing is to see that it is a sustained effort to seek to establish something like an essential intersubjective connection with the other, to actively engage with them, ideally over time. And this may involve hearing their stories in an express effort to appreciate differences and similarities between their situation and our own. This is not the same as attempting to understand the other by, in any snapshot way, putting oneself into the other's place or taking the other's perspective. Those activities, I think, largely what was described in the example earlier, I think can be done, but I think that as I said, that comes in an interchange rather than a unidirectional attribution. So finally, with respect to epistemic objectification, the authors of that paper write, quote, Fricker recognizes that one can be undermined as an epistemic agent not only by being perceived as a bad informant, but also as, quote, a mere source of information. So unlike an informant, when someone tells one something one wants to know, a source of information conveys knowledge that the hearer can glean. And if we look at the standard statements, you can see why this worry might arise if we're thinking of this as in the usual model of theory of mind or simulation theories. Quote, as Heidi herself says, quote, simulation here means imagining that we are in another's situation and then seeing how we would react to it. As she puts it, we simulate, the idea goes, not in order to feel, do, or believe what the other person feels, does, or believes, but so as to gain information about how we would feel, do, or believe. And we do that by, simply through these acts of imagining. The contrasting case that I've been trying to make, and I've been making this point for a long time, is that if we operate by attending to the other's narratives, what we're really doing is honoring what I've called before in previous writings, the horse's mouth's principle. So one-to-one extended second personal dialogue through which the other tells their story is the most reliable, though still fallible, way that we can learn of another's reasons for acting and come to appreciate them. Understanding ourselves and others on this model then, or this account, requires the development and exercise of a narrative competence, one that involves learning how to listen to explanations people give of their actions in the form of personal narratives so as to appreciate what motivates those actions. And this is the final slide, and this comes from a much older paper of mine, but I thought it was pertinent here. Quote, in listening to another's account, we sometimes expand the scope of what we deem acceptable. This is normally achieved when the other fleshes out on a larger canvas why they took an action, sometimes introducing a different set of values such that we are brought to see it in a new light. Or, more conservatively, we may at least begin to see why the action might make sense to them, even if it still leaves us or would leave us cold. And that's all I have to say for the moment.